Until his death in 220, Tertullian argued that Christians should hold fast to their faith in pagan society. Persecution in its full force, however, did not begin till around January 250, so some years after Tertullian's death. Christianity in North Africa is often assumed to be persecuted continuously over a long period of time, that the Christians were under constant attack. That was not really the case. Actually, persecution was relatively limited and local. In the first 3 centuries of the church, most Christians lived lives that were relatively free to move about in the cities. But by the year 200, there were about 200,000 Christians in the sprawling empire of Rome, which was still less than 0.5% of the whole population. To give an idea of the growth of Christianity, however, in this period, one would have within 50 years, so around the year 250, about 1 million Christians. The 3rd century was a time of exponential growth in the population of Christians within the empire. But it was also a tumultuous time for that empire. There were military defeats, famine, plague. Emperors came and went with great rapidity, many of them killed. It was the Emperor Decius who entered Rome in the year 249, who believed that those who did not worship the Roman gods or pay honor to the Roman emperor posed a threat to society. In this respect, the Jews had long been exempted from this practice, but the Christians not, and their refusal to participate in the public rites of Roman religion made them deeply suspicious, but also made them obvious. They stood out. The first official attack against the African church came by public edict in 249, requiring the Christians to pray for the salvation of the emperor. Now Christians found themselves facing a dilemma. In response to this dilemma, a variety of mentalities emerged. Some followed the instructions and bowed to the edict, going so far, really, as sacrificing animals. This was a decision for which many would later be punished. Others found it inexcusable and inconceivable to reduce their faith and preferred to flee, while still others declared their dissatisfaction with those who put their lives at risk. The imperial officials required Christians to appear before them and to make a personal and public sacrifice which could not be hid. That meant that they had to show up and reveal themselves. There was no place to hide. And as one historian has written, what a Christian did was known to others in the city or towns and to other Christians. In this period of persecution, the great figure of the North African church was Cyprian, who lived from 200 to 258. And here we have an 11th century representation of Cyprian's martyrdom. Like Tertullian, Cyprian was a highly controversial figure. He had the ill fortune of becoming a bishop in the year 249. That was the year that Decius had entered Rome and the decree had been made. It was the time when the persecutions had begun. That persecution was particularly fierce in Carthage. And here we have the remains of the amphitheater in which many Christians lost their lives, including those of Perpetua and Felicitas. Many of those Christians, however, gave in. And Cyprian did something that was highly controversial. In the face of the persecution, he went into hiding. What he knew, that in places of persecution, it was often the most senior official who was first targeted. And he believed that by going into hiding, he could more effectively lead the church and to preserve order. He was extraordinarily fiercely criticized for that decision. The question of the lapse of those who both either fled persecution or agreed to make the sacrifice dominated the church. Cyprian pleaded for patience because he was concerned for the unity of the church. What he could see was that it was fragmented, and that he was aware of the degree to which many of those who had conformed had damaged the faith. But he also knew that simply to punish them risked ripping apart the fabric of the church. The position that Cyprian took was that no one should be able to forgive the sins of those who had practiced idolatry except the bishop, because others had been undertaking this. And Cyprian said, no, this must be the work of the bishop in order to preserve order and authority. The North African bishops met to discuss this question of how to balance compassion with the demands of the gospel. Cyprian was absolutely devoted to those who had given their lives for the faith, those who were martyrs. And it was to their community, the community of the martyrs, that those who lapsed had to be reconciled. Another major issue that arose, though it was related, concerned baptism. With all the persecutions that were taking place, a great number of splinter groups emerged, sects. And amongst these, there was a range of practices and attitudes and degrees of rigor. Those who practiced baptism within those groups, the question was, were those baptisms valid in the Catholic Church? In North Africa, a particular view was taken, and that view was defended by Cyprian, who argued that those who had been baptized in these groups should be rebaptized. A different position was taken in Rome, and Rome and Carthage found themselves at odds in this case. So much was this the case that Pope Stephen denounced Cyprian as Antichrist. This debate between Cyprian and Stephen would only come to an end with their deaths. The persecution of 250s were carried out by an empire that was fighting for its life. The empire faced war on all its frontiers and internal instability. But the persecution, which ended the lives of so many, represented here in a Tunisian mosaic where the Christians are put to the wild beasts. Although so many lost their lives, it ultimately did not put a stop to the great growth of Christianity in the 3rd century. As a leader, Cyprian was a model of constancy. And when he was finally arrested, he adamantly refused to conform and prepared himself for a martyr's death. That death would come in September 258, when he would be beheaded and his body torn apart. The last and most severe persecution would come later under Diocletian, and in the years between 303 and 310. The Emperor Diocletian had sought to reorganize the empire and its administration, to make it more centralized and under the emperor's control. And this reform was based on the equality of the vast territories of the empire, and was intended to bring to an end the preeminence of Italy. Diocletian's reforms, however, were not particularly successful, and it resulted in there being a range of emperors at the same time, naturally in a degree of rivalry. Also, the reforms were carried out in a way that was rigid and not particularly effective. But he was eventually, although Diocletian had not initially been inclined to persecute Christians, he was eventually persuaded to do so, that Christians posed a threat to the empire. And in 303, one of the most fierce periods of persecution began. It became known as the Great Persecution. Nevertheless, fierce as it was, once more the results were sporadic. And in the East and Africa is where it took place most effectively, while in the West there was very little persecution at all. One of the lasting consequences of persecution was schism. Christians were required by edict under Diocletian to hand over their sacred books. For many, this was regarded as apostasy. When Mansurius, the bishop of Carthage, largely cooperated with the state officials, he was fiercely criticized by those who saw this as a betrayal of Christ, a betrayal of the church. The controversy was so fierce that it led to the splitting of the church in a crisis known as Donatism, to which we shall return a little later, when we speak of Constantine and of Augustine. But under the figure of Donatus and his followers, there was growing resistance to the church, which was seen as lax and compromising, a story in a way we've already heard before with Tertullian and Cyprian. And despite being condemned by Rome in 313, the Donatists survived for a long and created a long tradition that would remain within the African church. The church was to remain unstained by communion with those who had collaborated, so held the Donatists. It was nothing less than a battle for the heart of the church, and this would continue into the next century. And the struggle between the Donatists and the Catholic Church, so central to the life of Augustine, would remain a distinctive part of African Christianity until the coming of Islam.